The Dyson Swarm was humanity's triumph. For the first time in history, they had created a near-total energy-harvesting structure, one that encircled the star like a sprawling lattice of solar collectors, feeding endless streams of power back to the colonies. It had taken nearly a century to build, every relay and panel a product of ambition and sacrifice, ingenuity and resilience. An endless horizon of light-catching panels and cylindrical reactors spun in perfect coordination, a living machine orbiting the bright star they called Helios. For the scientists stationed in Observation Post G12, it was the culmination of countless hours, years of toil, and lifetimes of research. The construction had been grueling, a feat only a unified and determined civilization could have achieved. Each collector was precisely placed to catch as much of Helios's radiation as possible without compromising the fragile orbits of the others. Together, these collectors fed a steady current of unimaginable energy back to the colonies on distant planets. Humanity's needs, once constrained by finite resources, had finally met an inexhaustible source. This structure was an answer to every problem, a solution to every crisis. This was what the scientists had told themselves, what they had promised each other when they began to build the swarm. Now, as the observation post floated in silence, its occupants watched the swarm in awe. From this distance, the collectors were minuscule, glinting pinpoints that shifted in subtle patterns as they absorbed Helios's light. The star's energy pulsed through the network like blood through veins, converging at relay points that hummed softly, transmitting the current back to Earth and the outer colonies. Even through the thick viewports of the observation deck, the brilliance of the star was overwhelming, a reminder of the colossal forces they had harnessed. Dr. Elena Park was the lead scientist on the project, and she had dedicated her entire career to this moment. She gazed at the screens, monitoring a constant stream of data flowing in from each relay. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, making adjustments as she analyzed readings, noting every detail with near religious fervor. Each fluctuation, each spike, each small variable was a puzzle piece in a larger, stunning tapestry. Behind her, the team of technicians and researchers murmured with satisfaction, marveling at the swarm's performance. Their excitement was palpable, the air thick with the buzz of accomplishment. They exchanged glances, words of encouragement, and laughs filled with relief. "Years," one young technician muttered, shaking his head with a grin. "Years, and it's finally done." For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. They watched as energy flowed smoothly from Helios, cycling through the swarm and back to their instruments. Elena felt a quiet pride in her team, in the collective brilliance that had made this project possible. But then a minor irregularity in the energy output caught her attention, an almost imperceptible dip, a mere fraction of a percent. "Odd," she murmured, leaning closer to the console. She ran diagnostics, recalibrated the instruments, and checked the readings from the previous hours. The data was precise, clear, almost flawless. Almost. Days later, another fluctuation appeared. This time, it was more pronounced, a slight hiccup in what should have been a perfect energy relay. Elena noticed it immediately, her brows knitting together. She called over Dr. Marek Salazar, her longtime colleague, and they pored over the data together. The numbers danced on the screen, irregular, erratic. "Helios isn't fluctuating like that," Marek muttered, frowning. "The swarm's design is supposed to buffer any minor anomalies. This should be impossible." Elena nodded, but as the days passed, the anomalies continued. Faint shadows began to flit across the screens, visual distortions at first, which they dismissed as glitches in the system. Yet, these shadows didn't behave like glitches. They moved with purpose, weaving around the relays and orbiting collectors in slow, almost deliberate patterns. On the observation deck, technician Rosa Lung was one of the first to notice them. "Dr. Park?" she called, her voice laced with unease. "There's something strange here." Elena turned, walking over to Rosa's console. The technician pointed to a live feed showing the swarm from multiple angles. Faint, almost translucent shapes were moving across the screens, darting between the panels, blotting out the light as they passed. Rosa increased the magnification, and Elena saw them more clearly. Vague, elongated forms like dark tendrils spiraling across the swarm's surface. "Maybe it's some interference from the star's radiation," Rosa offered, her tone uncertain. Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. "Check for calibration errors and see if the other stations are detecting this." Soon, more reports of anomalies began flooding in. Stations positioned farther from Helios noted similar disturbances, strange shapes, fleeting blips of data that seemed to vanish when scrutinized. Some of the scientists brushed it off as noise from the massive energy currents, but Elena wasn't convinced. She sent out a team to inspect the relay stations, issuing strict protocols for safe distances and caution. When the team returned, their findings were puzzling. Tiny, coral-like growths had appeared on the outer shells of several relays, organic formations clinging to the panels. They were delicate structures like filaments, pale and translucent, each one pulsing with a faint, eerie glow. They seemed harmless, almost beautiful, yet something about them sent a chill down Elena's spine. Marek, usually the skeptic, inspected the samples with a look of trepidation. "It's almost as if this thing is alive," he muttered. The scientists analyzed the growths extensively. They tried burning them, freezing them, even exposing them to radiation, but nothing seemed to affect the filaments. In fact, they seemed to adapt, shifting slightly in texture and color, almost as though they were reacting to the probes. Meanwhile, the shadows continued to flicker across the swarm, appearing now even on the fringes of Helios's light. Some researchers reported seeing them move along the corridors of Observation Post G12, shadowy tendrils coiling and uncoiling, there one moment and gone the next. Unease settled over the team, an unspoken tension as they went about their work with a new sense of wariness. One night, Dr. Park stayed late on the observation deck, studying a particularly puzzling set of readings. She was alone, her colleagues having retired for the night. The viewports around her glowed with the ambient light from Helios, casting the room in a soft, almost hypnotic glow. She felt herself beginning to doze when a movement caught her eye. A flicker of shadow moved across the viewport. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she looked closer, the shape grew more distinct. It was not a mere shadow, but something darker, denser, with long, spindly tendrils reaching out toward her. She blinked, her breath caught in her throat. The tendrils slid along the glass, pulsing in the same faint, rhythmic pattern she had seen on the organic filaments earlier. A primal instinct told her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The creature, or whatever it was, pressed closer to the glass, and she saw it was not alone. More shadows loomed in the darkness beyond, coalescing, drifting toward the observation post as if in response to the swarm's energy. A sharp crackle burst from the radio beside her. "Doctor." "Park?" It was Marek's voice, filled with static. "We're getting spikes across the board. You need to see this." Elena forced herself to look away, stumbling over to the console, her heart pounding. The data was cascading across the screen, energy fluctuations in the swarm, strange signals broadcasting in irregular pulses, signals that seemed almost organic. A voice, barely audible, whispered through the static. Elena stared at the screen, the horror dawning on her as the data sank in. The Dyson Swarm, her life's work, was no longer a mere machine. It was changing, adapting to something beyond their understanding. Something that had waited in the dark void around Helios, silent and dormant, now roused by the energy they had so foolishly harnessed. The initial anomalies in the Dyson Swarm's output could have been dismissed as minor glitches, early quirks of a monumental project still settling into stability. Yet, the unsettling irregularities did not fade. They intensified, twisting from oddities into ominous signs. The team's early elation began to wane as each day revealed more inexplicable phenomena, a relentless unraveling of their achievements. It began with the energy readings. Initially steady and smooth, the power relays began to show irregular spikes and sudden drops, data patterns shifting unpredictably without any discernible cause. At first, Dr. Elena Park and her team thought it was interference from the star's own natural fluctuations. But Helios was stable, its radiation steady and strong, and the swarm was designed to account for its minor fluctuations. This behavior defied explanation. "What's causing these spikes?" Elena asked, her voice a mix of frustration and worry. She stood over Marek's console, watching the readouts intently. Marek rubbed his temples, his eyes bloodshot from hours of scrutinizing the data. "I don't know. It's like there's something in the swarm manipulating the energy flow. But there's no logical source for it. We've accounted for every variable." The team launched a series of inspections. They scanned each relay, every individual collector, every single kilometer of the swarm's sprawling architecture. No equipment was malfunctioning. The collectors were intact, aligned with Helios perfectly, absorbing its energy without issue. And yet, the data continued to show strange oscillations, as if the energy itself were somehow alive, reacting to something unseen. Then came the sounds. The first report came from technician Rosa Leung, whose workstation was closest to the primary observation deck. She was reviewing some low-frequency radio data when she heard it. A faint, erratic pulsing, almost too quiet to register at first. But as she turned up the volume, the sound grew louder, an irregular, rhythmic noise that seemed to pulse in sync with the energy spikes. "Dr. Park, you have to hear this," Rosa whispered, her voice filled with unease. Elena and Marek rushed over, and Rosa replayed the audio. It was a bizarre, oscillating beat, like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of static. The sound held an unnatural quality, a disturbing irregularity, as though it came from something alive yet profoundly alien. "That's impossible," Elena muttered. "The swarm doesn't produce sound, certainly not anything like this." Rosa swallowed, her hands trembling. "I thought it was feedback from the relay frequencies, but it's only getting louder. And it's changing." The sound grew in intensity over the following days, morphing from faint pulses to distorted murmurs, fragments of something almost intelligible. Some team members claimed to hear faint whispers in the static, phrases they couldn't quite make out, syllables forming and dissolving like smoke. At night, in the dead silence of Observation Post G12, these murmurs became nearly unbearable, filling the hallways and empty rooms with a disquieting, ghostly presence. Some described it as a sensation of being surrounded by unseen figures, others as a low, constant hum vibrating through their bones. But the warnings weren't limited to sounds and energy spikes. The organic filaments on the swarm surface continued to spread, growing thicker and more elaborate. What began as thin, coral-like tendrils had developed into intricate patterns, like veins, snaking across the metallic surfaces of the relays and collectors. Each filament glowed faintly, pulsing in sync with the mysterious sounds and energy fluctuations. Samples taken from these growths revealed alien biomimetic structures, unlike anything they'd encountered before. The material was resistant to extreme temperatures, radiation, even attempts to cut through it. "They're not just alive," Marek murmured as he examined a sample under the microscope. "They're adaptive. This organism, whatever it is integrating with the swarm." Elena's gut twisted. The swarm, her crowning achievement, was no longer purely human. It was changing, as though merging with a foreign intelligence that had latched onto their technology, feeding off their energy like a parasite. The situation escalated when more shadows began appearing across the swarm's surface, detected through infrared and high-resolution cameras. These weren't just anomalies. They moved with a distinct, disturbing intent, slithering and coiling around the collectors like predators circling their prey. They had form now, dark, elongated shapes with spindly limbs, each one shifting and stretching as if testing the boundaries of their newfound environment. Technician Rosa caught sight of one on the main monitor and stifled a gasp. "It's watching us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's aware." She wasn't alone in her fear. Nightmares and disturbed sleep became commonplace among the crew. Elena herself found her dreams filled with strange visions. Vast black tendrils spreading across the stars, consuming light itself, reducing everything to a deep, impenetrable darkness. She would wake drenched in sweat, the haunting feeling that something was peering into her mind, exploring her memories, learning who she was. One day, when checking the relays, the team noticed an unexplainable transmission originating from the swarm. A repetitive signal echoed back to them from one of the collectors, mimicking their own transmissions in a twisted, distorted manner. It was as if the swarm were speaking to them, parroting their own signals back, but each time with a strange twist, like an echo from an unseen intelligence trying to understand human communication. Marek's face grew pale as he listened. "It's mimicking us," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Something in the swarm is learning." The scientists scrambled to identify the source, but every attempt to trace the origin of the signals failed. They would lock onto a relay only for the signal to shift, sliding from one collector to another, always just out of reach, like a predator stalking them from the shadows. With each passing day, the organic matter continued its silent invasion, spreading across the swarm and embedding itself deeper into the machinery. Tendrils reached into wiring, connected to energy nodes, and even the hardened exteriors of the observation posts. The atmosphere on observation post G12 grew more oppressive, more claustrophobic. As the organism spread, it began to emit a faint, sickly odor, a mix of decayed metal and spoiled ozone, a smell that clung to their clothes, their hair, their skin. Rosa, who had been the first to notice the strange sounds, reported a sensation of something crawling beneath her skin. She scratched her arm, leaving red marks, but the itching persisted, a persistent tingling that seemed to spread through her entire body. She wasn't alone. Others began to feel it too, a faint but undeniable crawling sensation, as though they'd been infected by whatever was overtaking the swarm. In desperation, Elena called an emergency meeting. The team gathered around the main console, faces pale and drawn, shadows under their eyes. Anxiety crackled in the air, thick with the unspoken fear that none of them could escape the spreading contamination. "This isn't just a malfunction," Elena said, her voice strained. "We're dealing with something alive, something that's using the swarm as a host." "But what can we do?" one of the engineers asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We're isolated out here, and if this thing has infiltrated the swarm, how long before it spreads further?" The silence that followed was suffocating, each of them haunted by the same question. They were on the front line of a mysterious infection that seemed to defy all laws of biology and physics. It was as though the swarm had become a trap, luring them in, binding them in place, refusing to let them leave. "We should report this to command," Marek suggested. "Evacuate and quarantine the whole operation. Whatever this is, it's beyond us." But even as he spoke, a low hum reverberated through the room. The lights dimmed, flickering in sync with the pulsing sounds, the same beat that now throbbed through every structure of the station, every piece of machinery, every surface. The sound was almost hypnotic, a slow, insistent thrum that seemed to penetrate each of their minds. Elena gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white. "We need to act quickly. If this thing continues to spread..." The words died in her throat as she realized what was happening. The Dyson Swarm wasn't just infected, it was changing, adapting, evolving into something that responded to them, watching them. Continuation of the story, coming soon.